The letter arrived on a bitterly cold January morning in 1869, when Margaret Harlow's options had dwindled to surviving another Boston winter in squalor or accepting the proposal of a stranger 2,000 miles away. She traced her fingers over the careful penmanship, the words of Maxwell Ingram, a cattle rancher from Weaverville, Colorado Territory, who promised her a life of purpose if not luxury. "I am not a wealthy man," his letter read, "but I have a sturdy house, good land, and honest work. What I lack is companionship and someone to share in building something meaningful. I will wait for you until summer's end, believing you will come." Margaret folded the letter and tucked it into her dress pocket. At 22, with no family remaining after the influenza took her parents and younger brother, she had spent 3 years working herself to exhaustion in a textile mill. Her fingers were perpetually raw, her lungs filled with cotton dust. The marriage proposal from a man she'd never met seemed both terrifying and like her only chance at something better. She replied that same evening, accepting his offer and promising to arrive by early summer. With trembling hands, she signed her name at the bottom of the page, wondering if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. In April, Margaret boarded the train heading west with everything she owned packed in a single trunk. The journey would take her to St. Louis, then by stagecoach and finally on horseback to reach Weaverville. Maxwell had sent train fare and $20 for expenses, along with a daguerreotype of himself, a serious-looking man with kind eyes and a strong jaw, perhaps 30 years old, standing beside a horse in front of a modest cabin. She kept the image close during the first leg of her journey, studying the face of the man who would become her husband. His letters had been straightforward but gentle, describing his 10 years in Colorado, the small herd of cattle he'd built, and his hopes for the future. She tried to imagine herself in that remote place, so far from everything familiar. The train car swayed as it clattered westward, the landscape outside transforming from the crowded eastern cities to sprawling farmland. Margaret shared her journey with other women traveling to meet husbands or start new lives. Some were mail-order brides like herself. Others were widows seeking fresh beginnings. "My Thomas has been out in Montana Territory for 3 years," said Eliza, a plump woman in her 40s sitting across from Margaret. "Says he's finally got enough saved to bring me and the children out. I ain't never been further west than Philadelphia. I've never left Massachusetts until now," Margaret admitted. "My intended has a cattle ranch in Colorado." "Colorado? Lord, girl, you're heading into wild country. Indians and outlaws and who knows what else. Your man better be worth it." Margaret nodded, not voicing her own doubts. Was Maxwell Ingram worth crossing a continent for? Was any man? The journey grew more difficult once they reached St. Louis. Margaret boarded a stagecoach that would take her through Kansas and into Colorado Territory. The roads were rough, the accommodations at way stations sparse. Her body ached from constant jostling, and dust worked its way into everything she owned. On the 6th day of the stagecoach journey, disaster struck. As they crossed a shallow section of the Arkansas River, the coach's wheel caught on something underwater and snapped. The vehicle tilted dramatically, and water began flooding in. "Get out! Everyone out!" the driver shouted. Margaret found herself waist-deep in rushing water, fighting to keep her footing on the slippery riverbed. A fellow passenger, a gentleman merchant, grabbed her arm to steady her. "Your trunk, miss," he said, pointing to where their luggage was being swept downriver from the damaged coach. Her heart sank as she watched her few possessions disappear. All she had left were the clothes she wore, Maxwell's letters and photograph tucked safely in her pocket, and a small purse with $8 remaining. They made it to the nearest settlement, a collection of rough buildings called Fort Aubrey, but the next stagecoach wouldn't arrive for a week. With her funds dwindling, Margaret knew she couldn't afford to wait or to purchase new clothing and necessities. Weaverville was still over 300 miles away. "There's a cattle drive heading northwest," the stagemaster told her when she explained her situation. "They'll be passing through Weaverville. Might be they'd let you travel with them, for a price or for work." The cattle drive was led by a gruff man named Samuel Thornton, who squinted at Margaret suspiciously when she approached their camp. "We ain't a passenger service, miss," he said, spitting tobacco juice onto the ground. "And it ain't proper for a lady to travel with 20 cowhands." "I can cook," Margaret offered desperately, "and mend. I'm traveling to marry a rancher in Weaverville. Please, Mr. Thornton, I have nowhere else to turn." Perhaps it was the mention of her intended marriage that softened him, or maybe just the determination in her eyes. "You'll ride in the chuck wagon and help Cookie with meals. First sign of trouble, we leave you at the next settlement." "Understood." Margaret nodded gratefully. "Thank you. I won't be any trouble." Life on the cattle drive was harder than anything she'd experienced before. She rose before dawn to help prepare breakfast for hungry cowboys, spent days bouncing in the wagon over rough terrain, and collapsed exhausted each night after the evening meal. Her hands blistered from working with hot pots and pans over an open fire, and her skin burned under the relentless sun. But there was also a strange freedom to this nomadic existence. The vast open plains stretched endlessly around them, dotted with wildflowers after spring rains. At night, the stars blazed in patterns she'd never seen in Boston's smoky skies. And the cowboys, once they got over their initial wariness, treated her with a gruff respect. "You're made of stronger stuff than you look, Miss Harlow," Cookie told her one evening as they washed dishes in a stream. He was a leathery man of indeterminate age with a scar running down one cheek. "Most city girls would have given up by now." "I can't give up," she said simply. "He's waiting for me. This rancher of yours better appreciate what you're going through to reach him." Margaret thought of Maxwell's letters, his patient words about building something together, his promise to wait. "He will," she said with more confidence than she felt. 2 weeks into the journey with the cattle drive, they encountered a band of Arapaho hunters. Tense negotiations followed, with Thornton trading tobacco and coffee for safe passage through their hunting grounds. Margaret watched from the wagon, heart pounding as the cowboys kept hands near their weapons throughout the exchange. That night, around the campfire, Thornton warned everyone to stay especially alert. "There's been trouble with some of the young warriors. Not all of them honor the treaties." His words proved prophetic when, 3 nights later, Margaret woke to shouts and gunfire. Several young warriors had attempted to steal horses, and a firefight had broken out. In the chaos, a lantern was knocked over in the dry grass, and flames spread rapidly toward the wagons. "Miss Harlow, get out of there!" someone yelled. Margaret scrambled from her bedroll as fire encircled the chuck wagon. Smoke stung her eyes and filled her lungs. She clutched Maxwell's photograph and letters to her chest as she ran, coughing, toward the river they'd been following. The cattle were stampeding, cowboys were shouting, and gunshots still rang out sporadically. In the confusion, Margaret found herself separated from the others, standing alone on the riverbank as the fire spread behind her. With no other choice, she waded into the cold water, praying it wasn't too deep. The current was stronger than she expected, pulling at her nightdress and threatening to sweep her away. She fought for each step, gasping when she stumbled into a deeper section and went under momentarily. When she finally reached the opposite bank, soaking wet and shivering, the chaos of the camp was distant across the water. The fire glowed orange against the night sky, illuminating the silhouettes of running men and animals. Margaret sank to her knees on the muddy shore, still clutching the precious letters to her chest. Somehow they'd stayed mostly dry, protected against her body. But she was alone, miles from anywhere, with nothing but her nightdress and Maxwell's words. As dawn broke, she assessed her situation. The cattle drive had been heading northwest, following the river. If she continued in that direction, staying close to the water, she might eventually reach Weaverville or at least find help along the way. With no other options, Margaret began walking. Her thin shoes had been lost in the river crossing, so she continued barefoot. The sun rose higher, turning her wet nightdress into a clinging, uncomfortable second skin. She tore strips from the hem to wrap around her feet as makeshift protection. By midday, hunger and thirst became pressing concerns. She drank from the river and foraged for berries, finding a few that resembled ones she recognized from back east. They were sour but edible. As evening approached, Margaret spotted smoke rising in the distance, not the wild billowing of a prairie fire, but the controlled plume of a chimney. Hope surged through her exhausted body as she quickened her pace. The small homestead belonged to the Miller family: Jacob, Martha, and their 3 children. They took one look at the bedraggled woman approaching their door and ushered her inside without question. "Lord have mercy, child," Martha exclaimed, wrapping a blanket around Margaret's shoulders. "What happened to you?" Through tears of relief, Margaret explained her journey from Boston, the stagecoach accident, joining the cattle drive, and finally the attack and fire that had separated her from the group. "I'm trying to reach Weaverville," she concluded. "My fiancé is waiting for me there." The Millers exchanged glances. "Weaverville's still a good 80 miles northwest," Jacob said. "Not a journey for a lone woman, especially not in your condition." "I can rest here tonight, but I must continue tomorrow," Margaret insisted. "He's expecting me." Martha provided a bath, clean clothes, and a hearty meal. That night, in a real bed for the first time in weeks, Margaret reread Maxwell's letters. The paper was wrinkled from its dunking in the river, but the words still gave her comfort. She traced her finger over his signature, wondering if he would still want her when she arrived penniless, without even a proper dress for their wedding. The next morning, Jacob Miller offered to take her as far as Silver Creek, a small settlement 20 miles away. "From there, you might find someone heading to Weaverville." "Thank you," Margaret said, her voice thick with gratitude. "I don't know how to repay your kindness." "Just be happy with that man of yours," Martha said, pressing a bundle of food and a spare dress into Margaret's hands. "Anyone worth crossing rivers and fire for must be special indeed." The journey to Silver Creek was uneventful, bouncing along in the Miller's wagon. Jacob tried to dissuade her from continuing alone. "Wait here a week or two. There'll be traders or mail carriers heading to Weaverville eventually." But Margaret couldn't bear more delays. "I've already been traveling for 2 months. He'll think I've changed my mind." In Silver Creek, she learned that a supply wagon would be heading toward Weaverville in 3 days. Rather than wait, she used some of the money Martha had pressed into her hand to purchase a sturdy pair of boots and set out walking, following the crude map Jacob had drawn for her. The terrain grew more challenging as she continued northwest. Rolling plains gave way to rocky foothills. The June sun beat down mercilessly, and afternoon thunderstorms drenched her without warning. At night, she built small fires for warmth and protection, jumping at every sound in the darkness. On the 3rd day of her solitary journey, Margaret spotted riders in the distance. She ducked behind rocks, heart pounding, until she could determine whether they were friend or foe. As they drew closer, she saw they were cowboys, not unlike those from the cattle drive. "Hello," she called, stepping into view cautiously. "Please, I need help." The men reined in their horses, clearly surprised to find a woman alone in the wilderness. "Madam," the leader tipped his hat, eyeing her warily. "You lost." "I'm trying to reach Weaverville," she explained. "I'm Margaret Harlow, traveling to marry Maxwell Ingram. Do you know him?" Recognition flickered across the man's weathered face. "Max Ingram?" Sure do. He's been asking everyone coming through if they've seen a woman matching your description. Heard about that stagecoach accident weeks back, but no one knew what happened to you after. Relief flooded through Margaret. He's still waiting for me? The cowboy chuckled. Madam, that man's been telling anyone who'll listen that you're coming. Won't hear otherwise. Some folks think he's gone touched in the head, but he says he made a promise to wait. They offered to escort her the rest of the way, a journey of 2 more days. As they rode, the lead cowboy, who introduced himself as Daniel, told her more about Maxwell. Known Max 5 years now, hardest working man in the county. Built that ranch from nothing. Plenty of women in town would have married him, but he got it in his head to write back east instead. Said he wanted someone who chose him deliberate like, not just because he was one of the few unmarried men around. What's he like? Margaret asked, hungry for details about the man she'd agreed to marry based on a handful of letters. Quiet sort, thinks before he speaks. Fair in his dealings. Can be stubborn as a mule when he believes in something. Daniel gave her a sidelong glance. Like believing you'd show up even after 2 months with no word. As they crested a hill on the afternoon of the second day, Daniel pointed to a valley below. There it is. Weaverville. The town was smaller than Margaret had imagined, a main street with perhaps 20 buildings, surrounded by scattered homesteads. Daniel led them down a path that branched eastward from the town. Ingram's place is about 2 miles out. Good water on his land, which is why he's done better than most. Margaret's heart pounded as a modest ranch came into view. A split rail fence enclosed a yard with chickens scratching in the dirt. Beyond stood a small cabin with a covered porch, smoke rising from the chimney. A corral held several horses, and in the distance, she could see cattle grazing on green pasture. A man emerged from the barn as they approached. Even from a distance, she recognized him from the photograph, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair beneath his hat. He shaded his eyes against the setting sun, then froze when he saw the riders. Daniel called out, "Special delivery for you, Max." Maxwell Ingram stood motionless for a moment, then strode toward them with purpose in every step. Margaret slid from the horse with Daniel's help, her legs suddenly weak beneath her. They stood facing each other, separated by just a few feet of dusty ground. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, deeper than in his photograph, and several days' worth of stubble on his jaw. "Miss Harlow?" His voice was exactly as she'd imagined from his letters, deep and steady, with a slight roughness to it. "Mr. Ingram." She managed a small smile, suddenly acutely aware of her travel-worn appearance and borrowed dress. "I apologize for the delay in my arrival." A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his serious features. "You came. Did you doubt I would?" "Not for a minute," he said, and the certainty in his voice made her breath catch. "Though others tried to convince me otherwise." Daniel and the other cowboys discreetly retreated, calling out congratulations and promises to return for the wedding if they were invited. Alone with Maxwell at last, Margaret didn't know what to do with her hands or where to look. This man was nearly a stranger, yet she had traveled across the continent to marry him. "Your journey was difficult," he said. "It wasn't a question. There were complications." She hesitated, then added, "I lost everything I brought with me. My clothes, my books, even my mother's locket. I have nothing to offer except myself." Maxwell stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "That's all I asked for in my letters." "You should know what you're getting," Margaret said, determined to be honest. "I've never lived in a place like this. I don't know how to manage a ranch. I can cook simple meals and so, but can you learn?" He interrupted gently. "Yes. Then we'll be fine." He gestured toward the cabin. "It's not much, but there's room for a garden out back. I thought you might like that, and I built shelves inside for books. We can get more when the peddler comes through." The thoughtfulness of these preparations touched her deeply. He'd been planning for her arrival all these months, believing in her promise to come. "Would you like to see inside?" he asked. "Or are you too tired from your journey? I've prepared the spare room for you until—" He trailed off, color rising in his cheeks. "Until the wedding, if you still want that." "I would like to see inside," Margaret said. "And yes, I still want the wedding." The cabin was simple but clean, with sturdy furniture Maxwell had made himself. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and windows let in the golden afternoon light. He showed her the kitchen with its cast-iron stove, the main room with a table and chairs and 2 bedrooms. "It's perfect," she said, meaning it. After her journey, the solid walls and roof seemed like the greatest luxury imaginable. Over the next 2 weeks, they became acquainted in person rather than through letters. Margaret learned the rhythms of ranch life, rising before dawn, tending to animals, preserving food for the coming winter. Maxwell taught her to ride, his hands steady on her waist as he helped her into the saddle. She told him the full story of her journey: the stagecoach accident, joining the cattle drive, the night of fire and her river crossing, the days alone in the wilderness. "You crossed rivers and fire to reach me?" he said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains. "Why didn't you turn back when things got difficult?" Margaret considered the question. "Your letters gave me hope, and I made a promise." "As did I." He took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. "I promised to wait for you, to believe you would come." "Why were you so certain?" she asked, genuinely curious. Maxwell looked at her, his expression serious. "I recognized something in your letters: determination, courage, the same qualities that helped me survive out here when I first arrived with nothing. I knew if anyone could make that journey and find happiness here, it would be you." They were married on a Sunday in late June, in Weaverville's small church. Margaret wore a dress the women of the town had helped her make, and Maxwell had a new shirt and polished boots. The cowboys who had found her kept their promise to return for the celebration, and the Millers made the journey as well, Martha embracing Margaret like a long-lost daughter. That night, in their home, Maxwell led her to what was now their shared bedroom. A handmade quilt covered the bed, and wildflowers stood in a jar on the dresser. "I want you to know something," he said, his voice low. "I fell in love with your words first, with your spirit, but seeing you now, knowing what you endured to reach me." He touched her cheek gently. "I didn't think it was possible to admire someone this much." Margaret reached up to cover his hand with hers. "I crossed rivers and fire, but you did something harder. You believed, without proof, without reason. You waited." "I would have waited years," he said simply. She stood on tiptoe and kissed him then, no longer a stranger but her husband, her partner in this new life. The years that followed were not always easy. Droughts threatened the cattle, and harsh winters tested their endurance. Margaret learned to shoot to protect the chickens from foxes, to deliver calves during blizzards, to preserve every bit of food they grew. Her hands grew calloused like Maxwell's, her skin tanned by the Colorado sun. In their 3rd year of marriage, Margaret gave birth to a son they named James, followed 2 years later by a daughter, Sarah. Maxwell built additions to the cabin as their family grew, first another bedroom, then a proper kitchen, finally a covered walkway connecting to a new barn. Margaret planted the garden Maxwell had promised her that first day, filling it with vegetables, herbs, and flowers from seeds Martha Miller gave her. She started a small school in their home when James reached learning age, teaching not only their children but others from neighboring ranches. Sometimes, on summer evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the sunset together, their children playing in the yard. Maxwell would take her hand, the gesture as natural as breathing after years together. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked once. "Coming all this way, facing all those dangers?" Margaret looked around at the life they had built, the thriving ranch, the healthy children, the home filled with books and music and love. "Never," she said firmly. "Some journeys are worth any hardship." When they celebrated their 10th anniversary, the entire town gathered at their ranch for the occasion. Their property had expanded, their cattle herd tripled in size, and their family now included 3 children, with another on the way. Daniel, who had found Margaret on the trail years before, raised a toast. To Maxwell, who never stopped believing. And to Margaret, who crossed rivers and fire to reach him. Maxwell squeezed her hand as they stood together, surrounded by friends and family. "I'd say we've built something meaningful," he whispered, echoing the words from his first letter. Margaret leaned against his shoulder, watching their children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "Something more than I ever dared to hope for," she agreed. That night, after the guests had departed and the children were asleep, they stood together on the porch of the home they'd built and improved over a decade. "I have something for you," Maxwell said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small wooden box and opened it to reveal a gold locket. "It's not your mother's, I know, but I thought perhaps it might serve instead." Tears filled Margaret's eyes as she lifted the delicate necklace. Inside was a tiny copy of the photograph Maxwell had sent her all those years ago, paired with a miniature portrait of herself that had been taken on a rare trip to Denver. "It's perfect," she whispered as he fastened it around her neck. "Not quite as perfect as you." He brushed a tear from her cheek. "My brave Margaret, who crossed a continent to reach me. My steadfast Maxwell," she responded, "who never stopped believing I would come." Under the vast Colorado sky, dotted with more stars than she could have imagined in her Boston days, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that every river crossed, every fire faced, every hardship endured had led her exactly where she was meant to be, home, in the arms of the man who had waited, believing.